Okay, welcome everybody to this little class about Shir ha-Shirim, the Song of Songs. And there's few enough of us that I'm not going to mute everybody, and people can feel free to interrupt me with questions or clarifications or additions or whatever it is you have to do while I'm talking. So I'm going to talk about what Shir ha-Shirim is, a little bit about what's in it, and then um, I'm going to address this question of why it's associated with Pesach, which is a little odd, and then we'll have time for discussion and questions and comments and things like that at the end. Okay. So to begin with, I thought I would just chant some of Shir ha-Shirim because it is chanted. It has trope. Excuse me a sec. Just like the Torah and Haftarot have trope, there's a special melody that Shir ha-Shirim is sung to, and so I thought I would just chant the first few verses so we get a sense of what that sounds like for people who haven't heard that before. So this is the very beginning, chapter 1, verse 1. Shir ha-Shirim asher lishlomo yishakeni minishikot pihu ki tovim dodecha miyayin lereach shmanecha tovim shemen turak shemecha al ken alamot ahevucha. So that's the way when we have a liturgical reason to use Shir ha-Shirim, that's the way it sounds. And that's not particularly common, maybe. It's only one time during the year when we do that. But I thought it was nice to hear. So to start with, about Shir ha-Shirim, I was getting a little background noise, so I did, in fact, mute y'all, but you can raise your hands or unmute yourselves if you'd like to say something. So what is Shir ha-Shirim? Shir ha-Shirim, the Song of Songs, is a biblical book. It's part of there's three parts to the Bible that we call Tanakh. The Ta stands for Torah. The Na stands for Nevi'im, the prophets. And then the Ach part, the Ch part, is for Ketubim, the writings. And that's sort of the miscellaneous part at the back of the Bible. There's a lot of things in there that just don't fit real well into the prophets section. And so Shir ha-Shirim, the Song of Songs, fits there. And it is notably one of only two books in the Tanakh where God's name does not appear. The other one being... Yes, Joe? Let's see if I can unmute you. What were you saying?
Is it Megillat Esther?
Yes, Megillat Esther. That is correct. You win. So, right. So, and Megillat Esther, we have a pretty good idea why that was included in the biblical canon, but we'll cover why the question of why the Song of Songs, Shir ha-Shirim, was included in the biblical canon is a little more fraught than Esther. So the title Shir ha-Shirim, commonly, I think from the King James Version, it was called the Song of Songs. And the phrase in Hebrew is a little bit obscure what that would mean. That certainly Song of Songs is what it could mean, sort of with the meaning of maybe the greatest of all songs. It could also, the word shir in Hebrew also means poem. And especially in biblical writings. And so maybe it means the poem of poems or the greatest of all poems or something like that. It could also possibly mean a song or a poem that is made up of poems or songs. In other words, that it's a collection of songs or a collection of poetry. And that actually fits the text pretty well because it is a work that is entirely poetic. In the Torah, we have poetic sections and prose sections. At least that's how we think of them. Similarly, in the prophets, we have that. But Shir ha-Shirim is pretty much all in poetry and biblical poetry. And you can tell that by meter and various things about the Hebrew. The very first line that I chanted, which says, Shir ha-Shirim asher li Shlomo, is also a little bit ambiguous what it means. Shir ha-Shirim is the name of the book. Shlomo is referring to King Solomon, and Asher means that. And then it uses this preposition le, which can mean a lot of different things. And one of the things it can mean is that this is the Song of Songs that was written by King Solomon. And this is traditionally how people understand it, that King Solomon wrote the book and that it is an expression of the loves of his youth, as opposed to, say, Ecclesiastes, which is an expression of the hard-won, difficult knowledge of old age. So here, Shir ha-Shirim, he's young, he's talking about love, and that's the other end of the lifespan for King Solomon. Another possibility is that it means that this is the Song of Songs that was written for King Solomon, or to King Solomon, and that could mean in his honor. And of course, it also could mean that it was a critique, that it was actually something that was intended to provide a counterpoint to the things that King Solomon did in his life. Because although King Solomon is known for having a lot of wisdom in our stories about him that we commonly tell, if you look at his life as it's told in the Tanakh, he also does some pretty horrible things. Even though he is supposed to be a person of peace, even his construction of the temple, which is his maybe greatest achievement both spiritually and physically, actually involves conscripting a lot of labor. It turns a lot of people into little more than slaves and consumes a gigantic amount of resources. It's not a project that we would really probably vote for if we were voting for it, because it hurt a lot of people. And he also famously didn't designate a successor or at least didn't do so successfully. So he really caused a splintering in the end of the kingdom because he didn't have a successor. So maybe it's possible that you could imagine that this biblical book was written as a critique of him, a book of love, written as a critique to him whose life was not full of love. In terms of the plot, if there's a plot to an epic poem, the primary protagonists are a woman and a man who are in the process of courting and consummating a passionate relationship of love. And for that reason, and for the reason that the name of God doesn't appear, there was a vigorous debate amongst the ancient rabbis in the Talmud in the Mishnah, about whether it should be actually included in the Tanakh or not. Should it be in the canonized form of the Bible? And some of them actually said that it should not, and in fact that it was a desecration to include it. And they pointed to the fact that it doesn't have any explicitly religious content in it, that it's all about human, romantic, sexual love, and that it's really very earthy and explicit in its descriptions of that love and a description of human bodies. So they wanted to exclude it from the canon. And Rabbi Akiva stood up for Shir ha-Shirim, and his argument was that it was a parable. And thus it was religious in the sense that it was a parable for the relationship between God and Israel. And because it was a parable, then it was appropriate to include, even though it does not explicitly mention God, but they have to read that into it, that it's an analogy, it's an allegory for the relationship between God and Israel. And he said about it that it was actually more holy than the other books of the Bible. Maybe for that reason, because its description, it was all implicit, that it was holier. And the great quote is from Mishnah Yadayim. He said, "The whole world is not as worthy as the day on which the Song of Songs was given to Israel. For all of the writings are holy, but the Song of Songs is the holy of holies." And Rambam in the medieval period, had argued that love is the highest way to relate to God. And so he also saw this love between people, as it's described in the Song of Songs, as being a really good analogy for the love between God and humanity. And in fact, I often say that, the love we experience with other people is the closest we're going to get to sort of physically feeling God's love. So that idea that there could be an analogy here between human loving relationships and the loving relationship between God and human beings is not a crazy idea. But this is how Rabbi Akiva got this book included in the canon, why we still study it today. I was saying liturgically, we in Ashkenazi tradition, we read the whole book traditionally on the Shabbat of Pesach, and it's associated with Pesach exclusively. In the Sephardic tradition, there's a tradition of reading the book every Friday night as a love song, and the idea that, on not just on Pesach, but on Friday night, after the end of the week, when we come to Shabbat, that's actually the consummation of the love affair between God and the Jewish people. We might be far from each other, God and humanity, during the week, but on Shabbat, we reconnect. And so it's in Sephardic tradition, they would recite it on Friday night. And that's the reason that if you look in Siddur Lev Shalem, the newest Siddur from the conservative movement, which we don't usually use on Friday night, but if you look in there, many excerpts from the Song of Songs are in there, because many of the parts have been set to music and are beautiful to sing. And so they're including those in there so that we can take advantage of that Sephardi tradition and sing it on Friday night. And also in Jewish culture in general, it's been the source text for many, many, many songs, certainly throughout Jewish history, but definitely in the last 100 years. So some of the most popular folk songs from Israel are based on the Song of Songs, like Dodi Li, right? Dodi Li Vanilo. So just quotes from the Song of Songs. And even very contemporary pop and rock musicians in Israel will use text of the Song of Songs as the text for their rock songs. So like most recently, I think Idan Reichel used a lot of, in his music, has used a lot of the lyrics from the Song of Songs, and other contemporary rock artists and composers have used it really extremely freely. You see those references everywhere. All right, so I'm just going to take a look at the chat so I can understand what was going on there. Yes, it is in the Christian Bible as well, which maybe is a little bit surprising, but it does figure in there. And again, that's why it's called the Song of Songs from King James, so it was included in his Bible. All right, we're going to go on. Does anybody have any questions about what it is and its place in Jewish culture in general? Okay, then. Well, then we're going to move on. We're going to move on to what is in it. Rashi really loves commenting on Shir ha-Shirim, and he gives a summary of the plot. So I'm going to give you the summary of the plot according to Rashi, and it's a pretty simple plot. I mean, it's very, reminiscent to us of many romance novels, movies that we might have seen, and it reminds me of when I was young and I went with somebody to see Casablanca in the theater, and we get to the end of the movie, and she turns to me and says, "Well, that was so cliched." Like, yeah, right. Well, that's because that's the classic source. So similarly, the Song of Songs can feel like, oh, this is a cliched love story, but that's because it's the source text for all the romantic stories that came after it. So the basic plot is that there's this young, beautiful woman, and she becomes engaged to and then marries a man, maybe a king. But very soon after the marriage, she is unfaithful to him. And then he sends her away, and she ends up in this status of living widowhood, where it's like she is a widow even though her husband is still alive, because she's separated from him and feels she can't return to him. But his love for her remains strong, and he keeps watching over her from behind the scenes, behind the curtain, to protect her. And then she resolves in the end to return to him and be faithful to him, and he will take her back with a love that is fully restored. So it's really, it really is boy meets girl, boy and girl break up temporarily, boy and girl still love each other, they get back together in the end. It's such a happy story. So as an allegory, and Rashi reads it as an allegory, like in the tradition of Rabbi Akiva, the idea is the way you read it in is say that the people of Israel were engaged to God when God took them out of Egypt. And then at Sinai, they stood beneath the chuppah, and sometimes they interpret the rabbinic legend of God picking up the mountain and holding it over the people's heads, not as a threat, but as the chuppah for the marriage between God and Israel. Or sometimes people say the clouds of glory, that was the chuppah over the people. And so they get married when God gives Israel the Torah, which serves as their ketubah. And then at the very foot of the mountain, right after the marriage, the people are unfaithful to God with the golden calf. And God, although upset, forgives Israel, brings Israel into the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, and Israel continues to sin, and God's patience eventually gets exhausted, and God sends the people away into exile. Right? This is a theological aspect of the destruction and the Babylonian exile. But while away from God, while far from God, distance makes the heart go fonder, and they realize how good they had it with God and long to be back and long to return to this intimate relationship with God that they had before. But they have trouble, in classic romantic fashion. When Israel approaches God, God turns God's back. When God finally approaches Israel, Israel turns away again, and they go back and forth. And while they're in exile, and eventually the idea is the people will return in teshuvah and repentance. God will accept Israel's repentance. And even in the meantime, before Israel completely repents, God is always watching over Israel behind the shutters, behind the scenes, and protecting Israel from any of its foes. So that's the way they tend to read it. In terms of the things that are in it, there's some incredibly beautiful poetry in Shir ha-Shirim, in the Song of Songs, and that really, it has its own beauty as poetry and as telling the story of this couple. And then there is the beauty of how it's read in the commentaries that are trying to read it as an analogy, and how they read into it this intimate relationship between God and the people. And I think it's worth noting that there are many religious traditions in which gods are said to love, but very often the object of their love is other gods, right? So in Hindu tradition, the romantic escapades of the gods are a large source of stories that people tell each other, and that are a really important part of the tradition. But it's not about the love of God for humanity. It's more about gods being interested in each other. So this is a different kind of way of viewing God as an intimate. And a lot of the imagery that we see in the Friday night service that the Kabbalists, the mystics in Tzfat, wrote into that service in Lecha Dodi or in Yedid Nefesh, are really about viewing God as an intimate, as somebody who's so close, like the beloved of my soul. That's Yedid Nefesh. That's what it means. So this idea that God has this intimate relationship with humanity, that's really carried out, it's exemplified by Shir ha-Shirim, and that's influenced a lot of different religious literature within Judaism, and influenced the tone of our prayers, particularly on Friday night, but at all times, even on the high holidays as well. So I just wanted to read some of these verses and give examples about how they are interpreted as an analogy. So, for example, at the beginning in chapter 1, it says in verse 4, the king has brought me into his chambers. We will be happy and rejoice together. We will recall our love as being greater than wine, our sincere and direct love. So Rashi would interpret this to say, according to this allegorical meaning, this refers to the strong and straightforward love with which people, and especially our ancestors, loved God. And this is the time when, we have these verses from the prophets talking about how the people followed God into the desert. That was a sign of the loving attachment between the people and God, not, as we sometimes read it, especially reading it in the Torah, the result of the people being overawed by God and feeling like overwhelmed with God's power and then being cowed, and that's why they follow God into the wilderness. Here it's reframed that was a relationship of love, that God courted the people and the people loved God and were drawn after God by the force of their love. Similarly, in near the end of chapter 1, when it says, "Behold, you are fair, my beloved. Behold, you are fair. Your eyes are like doves," and Rashi says this is like what it says in the Torah when it says that I, Israel, was ashamed of my misdeeds, and God strengthened me with words of appeasement, saying, "I have forgiven according to your words." And the and the idea of doves, the idea of your eyes are like doves, is the idea that doves, we have in our popular culture to this day, that doves are mate for life. And so the attachment between God and the people is one that's a lifelong attachment. It's an eternal attachment. It's not one that's easily thrown over. So even though there may be breaks in that connection, we return to each other and we don't give up on each other, the humanity and God. In chapter 2, we have this, the phrase that gave us the song Dodi Li, "My beloved is mine, and I belong to my beloved, who pastures among the roses." The next line is, "Until the sun spread and intensified and the shade fled." And that, that's intended to be, they're so wrapped up in each other that they don't notice the passage of time and the sun getting hot. But allegorically, the idea is that the people that the people were connected to God at the time, say, of the giving of the Torah or the offering of the Passover sacrifice in Egypt. And then when things got tough, when they felt abandoned because Moses went up to Mount Sinai again, they turned to the golden calf. So they were with God in the beautiful, cool time, but when the sun got hot, when things got tough, they turned their back on that relationship. Let's see, what else can we pull out of here? Oh, yes. This beautiful verse in chapter 5, when it says, and this has been the inspiration for many songs, I was sleeping, but my heart was awake. It's a really beautiful image. A sound, my beloved is knocking. Open for me, my sister, my beloved, my dove, my perfect one, for my head is filled with dew, the locks of my hair with the rains of the night. So here Rashi interprets this allegorically as being sleeping and having your heart awake. Sleeping is being far from the worship of God. And here it's saying, he says, I neglected, when I was peaceful and calm in the days of the first temple, I neglected worship. And this is something that's predicted even in Deuteronomy, where it says, when you are satisfied, when you have enough food to eat and clothing to wear, and you're not beset by enemies, you're going to forget all about God. God says, you're going to forget all about me. You're not going to pay attention to me. So here, the allegory is, I was sleeping. In other words, I had forgotten in my daily life about the worship of God. My heart was awake because my heart still remembered. My heart still was filled with a loving attachment to God, but I wasn't acting that out in my life. And when my beloved knocked, I opened the door. So God is knocking at us. God is asking to be let in and come back. And how does God knock? God knocks through the words of the prophets. God knocks through the words of contemporary prophets, calling us back to the way of Torah. And when God knocks in that way, ideally, we open the door. We don't stay asleep. and say, ah, I'm not paying attention to that anymore, and I'm just feeling it in my heart, we actually wake up and say, oh, there is something that needs to be done in order to cleave to God, not just this dream that I had in my heart, but something that I could act out. Yes. All right. Okay. And in chapter 5, it says, I have removed my garment. How shall I put it on? I have washed my feet. How shall I soil them? And this is referring to, lovers who are in bed and they're in a place. How can they imagine leaving that place? But Rashi actually says it reads it the other way from the allegorical point of view and says, I have removed my garment. That is to say, I've taught myself an alien way. I've figured out how to live in a world where I don't relate to God in this intimate fashion. How can I go back? And the right the I'm sorry, I'm just trying to figure this out here. Yeah, the idea is that God, this is the place that people get to when they feel far from God, and sometimes the rabbis identify this with the evil inclination. It whispers to us and says, there's no way back. If you've broken that relationship, there's no way to repair it. Don't even try. And the rabbis say we have to ignore that voice and listen to the other, more positive voice inside us saying that there is a way back. God created teshuvah, God created repentance. There's a way to repair, always a way to repair our relationship, even if we feel that we have taken a step too far beyond. And then coming to the very end, in chapter 8, it's written, flee, my beloved, and liken yourself to a gazelle or to a young hart upon mountains of spices. And here Rashi says that when it says flee or fly, it's speaking to God and asking God to hasten the redemption, to rest the divine presence on the mountain of spices. And the mountain of spices is, in this reading of it, Mount Moriah, the mountain on which the Temple Mount was created according to the rabbis, and the Holy Temple. And so it's ending up with this hope of restoration of a house of God, the house in which the couple, Israel and God, were able to live and make a home together. So that's just a little bit about what's in it. It's a very long book. It's 8 chapters. When the process of actually reading through the whole thing on Shabbat Chol Hamoed Pesach means that services last very late in services that choose to follow that tradition. And our services at GJC run the gamut. I think in Minyan Masorti, typically we'll read the entire book, chant the entire book with people taking turns in different chapters. In Dorshei Derech, they might discuss the book but not actually chant it. And in the Cherry service, typically we read selections from Shir ha-Shirim to get the flavor of it without reading the entire thing. So, questions for the moment about what's in Shir ha-Shirim and what the allegory is supposed to teach us. Okay, let's see, Wendy.
Okay, yeah. So it's sort of an open statement that's a question. As you were talking about this, I was thinking about how many places in the Torah that God is framed as a parent. And this is this mutual, I want to say, that's too modern a word for Shir ha-Shirim, but it is a lover's relationship that is the allegory, and therefore is not that hierarchy, if we can put aside if there's, I don't know if there's sexism in it or not, I don't sort of care right now, but just the whole notion of it is lovers rather than the parent-child or the father-child. And that struck me as kind of interesting, as kind of a counterweight to the whole, king dad on the throne talking down. So I was just interested in your comments or others' comments on that. There appear to be, you said you sort of alerted us to the Kabbalah Shabbat, where there's this loverly kind of, not lovely, but loverly kind of thing as well. But just I'm interested in people's comments and your response to that, Adam, as well. And I'll mute myself.
Oh, very
I
nice.
won't.
I mean, I think that there are actually many different relationships between humans and God, found even in the Torah. It is very often this sort of hierarchical, sort of king ruler judge kind of relationship, but there's also talk about God as sort of a friend who walks next to us, right? In like Abraham, and maybe even Jonah, Noah. There is talk about walking with God. So there is a kind of mutuality, and I think, and in other words, I think it cycles through a lot of different kinds of relationships, searching for effective analogies to our relationship with God, because it's so difficult to understand that relationship and understand what God is. So the Tanakh uses all different kinds of analogies to do that. And I do think that one of the reasons that Rabbi Akiva and those who sided with Rabbi Akiva's tradition was so intent on including this book in the Tanakh was to provide this really heavy counterweight of, yes, mutuality in the relationship between God and humanity, to offset some of the real big hierarchy and kingly ruler anger that when people talk about the Old Testament God, they're really talking about certain sections, right? Where God acts, the character God acts in those particular ways, and discounting sections like the entire book of Song of Songs and other places where God has this more of a mutual relationship. So I think it's trying to open up for us the range of what this relationship with God can be, and it's not that we have to choose one. I think that it can be at different parts of our lives, in different situations that we're in different parts of the life cycle. We can feel that relationship differently, and that can be good and useful in our lives to be able to have those relationships. But I do feel like we often get really stuck on the hierarchy and discount the kind of mutuality that's here, because as often say to when teaching kids that if you look at the Torah, God does not act very much. Mostly God is trying to persuade human beings to do stuff. God appears to actually need humanity. And certainly the rabbis thought that God created human beings for a reason, and that reason was because God wanted to act in the world, but God could not. God needed us to do it. And so there is a mutual dependence that God and humanity have on each other. And ideally, that's a loving kind of dependence, right? In the same way that we depend on our friends and lovers and partners, we depend on each other, and we want that to be a loving kind of dependence. There should be that kind of interdependence in our relationship with God as well.
Well, if I can just add, and then I'm going to let others speak. We have to also, though, pay attention to the passionate and sensuous and sexual imagery that's here. And I get it as well. You could see it as allegorical for the passionate attachment. But I remember first hearing this years ago, and this allegorical interpretation. And I thought, okay, well then, yes, mutuality and all of that. But come on, folks, look at it. It's really hot and heavy. So what do we do with that? I mean, do you just want to like wash that away and say, well, that's the intensity that we have? I mean, that's a little too PG. So I just want to throw that into the conversation as well, because we keep using the word mutuality. I started out with that, but we can't ignore that other dimension to it. So I'd love to hear something about that as well.
Marilyn has something to say.
So my question is a bit like Wendy's statement. I wonder if the rabbis, or if there is any sources that talk about people not seeing the book as an allegory, And were those people shunned or accepted by certain parts of society?
Yeah, I think that, see, I think one of the important things here is that seeing it as an allegory does not erase it as also a story between a man and a woman, in this case, between a passionate couple. In other words, we have this feeling that like it's read one way or it's read another way, and the rabbis didn't usually have that feeling. So when they read even a story from the Torah in an allegorical way, they don't mean that the story is now erased and it only means the allegory. They mean the allegorical meaning is on top of the plain meaning of the story, and then there might be a homiletic meaning, and there might be a moral meaning, there might be a legal meaning, and they put all those on top of each other and say they don't erase each other, right? It's sort of like, I don't know, it's not really like transparencies because that still covers one up, but that's that kind of idea that you can always see the original story or the passion story underneath the allegorical story. So I don't think they're intending to deny that part of it, or to deny the passionate sexuality of Shir ha-Shirim, because it is passionately sexual. It's not just like these human characters do not love each other solely for their minds. There's a lot of description of bodies and parts of bodies, and that's really important to the text. And I think that also was important to the ancients and certainly to the medievals about this book to glorify that, to glorify sexual love and the love of bodies, and say that that actually is also something holy. That's something that's in the Bible, it's in the Tanakh, and should be celebrated and enjoyed. And especially, I'm saying especially the medievals, because the medievals were dealing contra Christianity, which, you know, a bunch of streams of Christianity were not saying that about the body, and not saying that about sexual love, and seeing that as a sort of concession to human frailty or something, or maybe just a form of reproduction, but not something that in itself should be celebrated and seen actually as in any way as holy. In fact, the opposite. They wanted to see it as the work of the devil. So I think that part of the book has been really important to Jewish conceptions of sex, of what sexual relationships should be ideally be about, and saying that, you know, yeah, sexual pleasure, like other kinds of pleasurable experiences in life, are things that we were actually put on earth to do. We were put on earth to enjoy those things, and we should be doing that, right? This saying that when the final reckoning comes after we die, we're going to be held accountable for every pleasurable thing we could have done on earth and we neglected to do, because those things are such a crucial part of life. Joe.
Thank you. So the discussion about inclusion in the Tanakh, that was after the destruction of the Second Temple. And that was not the happy ending of the Song of Songs. So do we also understand the argument to include it as a promise that our story is not yet over, and although with Rabbi Akiva was immediately after the destruction of the Second Temple, so we will be restored in the future, and to have faith. And that's a very powerful argument, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean it. In at least in that Mishnah, the Rabbi Akiva does not explicitly make that argument. I do think that is an implicit argument of the rabbis, that just as the Torah does not come to a conclusion in which the happy ending in which the Israelites go into the land, it's not consummated. And Shir ha-Shirim itself, it's not clear at the ending what's going to happen to these lovers exactly. They seem to be together, but that last thing that says flee, it's almost like flee and I'll meet you later. And that is what the rabbis were hoping our story was going to be as well, that God did seem to have fled away from us, and that we were going to be able to meet up at some future point, that our story exactly was not finished, and that we would be able to come back and consummate this relationship sometime. Okay. All right, I do want to go on to address this question of why Shir ha-Shirim is associated with Pesach. Um, so Shir ha-Shirim is considered to be within the writings. There are these 5 books that are called the 5 Megillot. And they're called the 5 Megillot, the Chamesh Megillot, because each of them was associated with a holiday. So the 5 Megillot are the book of Ruth, that tells Ruth's story, the book of Lamentations, Echa, the book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, the book of Esther, and the Song of Songs. That's the 5. And each of them is associated with a holiday. So the book of Ruth is associated with Shavuot. And the rationale there is, we assume, because it's set during the harvest time, and Shavuot was originally a harvest holiday. So that seems to make some sense. The book of Lamentations, Echa, which is read at Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, the rationale is very direct, that is framed as a lament for the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And that's what the holiday is all about. The book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, is maybe the most obscure. It's read on Sukkot, and it's hard to rationalize it being on Sukkot. Sukkot is supposed to be the happiest of holidays, the holiday that the rabbis called the holiday. And so why would you have this book that's full of rather depressing wisdom about, nothing ever changes, vanity, vanity, always vanity. Why would you have this happen? And so the rationale that people have been able to come up with is that, okay, well, maybe this is about our sense on Sukkot that things are temporary, that the season that we're in, the season of fall, although it's filled with beautiful colors and with harvest foods, we know it's going to fade quickly. And the lulav and etrog itself that we use to celebrate Sukkot, we know that almost from the moment we get it, it starts to get dry, it starts to rot and mold. So the idea that there's transience is highlighted at Sukkot in some ways, and so maybe that's why the book of Ecclesiastes is appropriate for Sukkot. The book of Esther, Megillat Esther, of course, is the story of Purim. It's the basis for the entire holiday, so of course it makes sense to read it on that holiday. And the Song of Songs gets Pesach. And what are its ties to Pesach? So I think, first of all, of course, it has a lot of imagery from the natural world, a lot of imagery that is associated with spring. And so that sort of makes sense that would be right at this season. It's also, right, the spring is the time of new growth, of rebirth, the return of life, creativity, people thinking about poetry and thinking about love. So that makes sense of it. And the fact that, in fact, courtship and love are often associated with spring, like in Camelot, apparently. May, it's really saucy month. So all those things may be associated with spring, the season of Pesach, which is important. The second thing is a little more obscure, so bear with me. This is about the idea that the creation of the world is analogous to the creation of the Jewish people, which happens at Pesach. That Pesach is really the birth of the Jewish people, even though Abraham was called by God and God said, I'll establish you as a great nation. They weren't really a nation. They were really more like a clan until we came out of Egypt. And that formative experience going through the waters, that really made us into a people. And so that is associated with the creation of the world. And the creation of the world, there was a debate amongst the ancient rabbis about whether the creation of the world happened in the fall at Rosh Hashanah or happened in the spring at the time of Pesach. And the Zohar, this preeminent book of Jewish mysticism from the Middle Ages, actually begins talking about the beginning of the world and making an analogy through the Song of Songs to springtime. So I wanted to take you through that a little bit because I just find it fascinating. This is what the Zohar does. This is Zohar 1:1, the very beginning, it begins with quoting Genesis 1:1 and says, "In the beginning." And then it says, Rabbi Shimon opened. What happened at the beginning? The flower buds appeared on the earth, which is from the second chapter of the Song of Songs, one of these very famous verses. The flower buds, he says, refer to the act of creation. And when did they appear on earth? On the third day, because it said on the third day in Genesis, let the earth sprout. And that was when the buds appeared on earth. So he's trying to map the creation onto the Song of Songs. And then he goes on to say, the time of singing has come, which is the continuation of that verse in the Song of Songs, and says this is the fourth day, when there was a reduction in light. And that's talking about the creation of the sun and the moon, because the rabbis taught that before the sun and the moon, it says there was light. How was there light before there was the sun and the moon? There was a supernal light that filled all creation. When the sun and moon were created, that light was taken away and hidden away for the righteous. As it says in one of the Psalms that we sing on Friday night, the light is sown for the righteous. That's how it happened. The light was taken away on that day. And that's the time of singing, according to them. And then it talks about the voice of the turtle dove in the Song of Songs, that he says that refers to the fifth day, where it's written, let the waters teem with living creatures to produce offspring. And then when it says is heard, the voice of the turtle dove is heard, that refers to the sixth day, where it is written, let us create the human being. And this anticipates the primacy of doing over hearing. For here it is written, let us create, which in Hebrew is the same as saying let us do. The verb for do and create are the same. Let us create the human being. And later is written, we will do and we will hear. That is when the Israelites are receiving Torah. And then in our land, the end of the verse in Song of Songs refers to Shabbat, which represents the land of life. And that appears to be a phrase of the Song of Songs, that Shabbat represents the land of life, the time when we truly live and anticipate the world to come. So they map each day of creation onto this one verse from the Song of Songs to say, maybe creation actually happened in the spring, and the Song of Songs is actually narrating the acts of creation for us. And that is the connection to Pesach, because Pesach is the beginning of the Jewish people, the creation of a new kind of world for them. It's year zero, year one, or whatever for the Israelites. And that happened in the spring, so spring is an appropriate time to be reading the Song of Songs, which references the spring. And then finally, the idea of love, associating Pesach and the Song of Songs because of love. Basically, it's reading Pesach as the basis of the relationship between God and Israel. And we see that all the time, both in the Torah and in our prayers, that we're always referring back to God saying, I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Remember that I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Don't forget you were slaves in the land of Egypt. That's not, I think, here being read as taking you to task, like, be good. I was really nice to you. I took you for ice cream, and now you're showing me bad behavior. It's instead saying, remember, we had a relationship there. We were really close to each other then. So remember that love that we had between us. It's also the idea that love was actually the motivation. God's love for the people, that was the motivation for taking them out of Egypt. In other words, as it says many times in the Torah and in rabbinic literature, God did not take the people out of Egypt because they were the best people in the world. We didn't win the prize, or we weren't the most righteous or the biggest or the strongest or anything like that. It was just God's love for us. God had love for us, and God ignored all the things that actually would have made us a terrible candidate for being God's people, and God took us out of Egypt anyway. So God, that love, even the taking out of Egypt, isn't just an expression of the love God already felt for us, unmotivated by our behavior. And that ties Shir, ha-Shirim, which is all about love, to the Pesach story. And it's also, as we were talking about, the idea that the relationship between God and Israel can be represented by many different forms of love, right? There's the love of friendship, like the relationship God has with Abraham, that one of the prophets says God called Abraham my friend. There's, of course, familial love that we see in the Torah mostly between parents and children. There's romantic love, which we actually also see in the Torah. And right, the love between parents and children, that's, as Wendy was saying, one of the primary ways we conceptualize God is as a parent. There's romantic love, like we were seeing in the Song of Songs, and we also see in the Torah. There's a more generalized sort of love of humanity, maybe, when in that phrase, which we sort of universalize more than the Torah meant it, but love your fellow human being as yourself, or love your neighbor as yourself. That's intended to inculcate in us a generalized love for humanity who are not necessarily our friends, not related to us, not our romantic partners, but are somehow deserving of our love just by being human. And then there's this love I was talking about, this unmotivated love that I think, at least speaking for myself, I'm sometimes uncomfortable listening to Christians talk about grace and feeling like, does that have any connection to Judaism? But I think when we talk about the word chesed, which is this kind of love that God has for the people, an unmotivated kind of love, that's kind of what some Christians mean when they talk about grace. In other words, the unmotivated love of God for humanity, or even unmotivated love between human beings, right? And the rabbis talk about that true love is a love that's not motivated by something. It's not motivated by something that you want, right? Whether it's sex or property or power, it's not motivated by something. It's something that has no motivation. And they say when love has a motivation, then once the motive is acquired, once the goal is met, then the love fades. But if love does not have a motivation, then it lasts forever, because there's no natural expiration date on that love. So that's the kind of love God can have for humanity that can make God take the people out of Egypt. But it's also the kind of love that, at our best, human beings can have for each other. This kind of unmotivated love that's not about what we want, even if what we want is simply for that love to be returned. That's still in some ways motivated by something. And there's this idea that maybe there is a place in human life for this unmotivated love, where we can love without the idea that we're going to control the object of our love, that we're going to get something from the object of our love. We can love it, as it were, for its own sake. And that is in some ways the highest expression of what God maybe was hoping for in taking the Israelites out of Egypt, teaching them Torah, and setting them loose on the world, that human beings would eventually maybe get to the point of being able to love each other with that kind of love. And that also, that dream, sort of from the God's eye point of view, is another reason that God would want to create the world in the first place, but also for the Israelites to take the Israelites out of Egypt, just for the chance that kind of love could come to the world. So, questions, comments, disagreements, arguments?
Why specifically on Shabbat Chol HaMoed?
Why on Shabbat Chol HaMoed? I think it's on Shabbat.
Is ha-Shirim read? Is it a practicality, or is there some significance to that?
I'm sorry, is it what?
Why do we read it on Shabbat Chol HaMoed Pesach rather than, say, the first day of Pesach or last day of Pesach, or some other time where everybody's in shul?
Right. So I think partly, certainly, there's a practical thing about wanting to make sure that there's time, and that on Shabbat, where are people going to go? You're not even going to cook, which on the other days of Pesach you might cook. But I think there is this idea that it's following up on the Sephardic tradition and saying that Shabbat also is this time of closeness between God and humanity. And so Shabbat is, the coincidence of Shabbat and Pesach even more is a time when you would want to read this book.
I was just imagining, I remember the time when I was in Tzfat many years ago, and I would go to shul on Friday night, and there was this shul at the edge of the hill, looking outwards into the valley, and of course they were singing Shir ha-Shirim on Friday night before Kabbalat Shabbat. So on the Sephardim on Shabbat Chol HaMoed Pesach, Shir ha-Shirim in the evening and Shir ha-Shirim in the morning.
I guess so. Yeah.
So, twice.
Yeah, I don't know that they say, I don't know they're always singing the whole thing every Friday night. Certainly the Sephardic synagogues I've been in, they have not chanted the whole thing. Oh yeah, some I'm sure do, but I'm not sure that they would also do it on the Shabbat morning of Chol HaMoed. Not all of them, at least.
On Shabbat or Friday night.
Yeah.
Yeah, because well, thank you very much. Yes.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rabbi Ivan. It's nice to see you. Be well.
Thank you.
Our best to Rita. And the best to your family, Rabbi, as well. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
so much. I don't know how you keep up with all these activities you're doing for us while we're stuck here and we're stuck there. I mean, you must be not sleeping. I mean, when do you do it all?
I'm trying to get some sleep.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all.